Hi everyone, my name is Tercia Strydom and I'm a scientist based in Kruger National Park, working for South African National Parks. I'm sorry that I couldn't give this talk in person today, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me. So I'll be talking about fire management and prescribed burning in Kruger National Park. So just for orientation, Kruger National Park is in the northeastern region of South Africa in the savanna biome, and it's approximately 2 million hectares. So it's a very big conservation area. And the climate we have in Kruger is ideal to support fires in the sense that we have these wet summers with this accumulation of fuel and biomass. And then we have these hot, dry winters where the weather conditions are ideal to support a fire. Fires in the system is a key abiotic factor that influences ecosystem processes in African savannas, and I know Sally Archibald is giving a talk on fire ecology. And savanna fires can either be ignited by humans, or whether this can be by accident or on purpose, and some fires are naturally occurring due to lightning. Our lightning fires, however, are less common and often do not burn through large parts of the park. And this is just an example of an experimental fire in central Kruger. Here we are in the GIF. So there are many reasons for burning. We have many reasons for burning inside the park, but many other land managers that also use fire as a management tool. So one is to promote fire's ecological role that we know it's part of the system. It helps with regeneration of vegetation, and it has this resprouts and fresh regrowth that is very nutritious, and animals love eating on these recently burnt areas. We also conduct quite a lot of research and experimental fires, and those are a lot of the fires that I'm quite involved in. And then there's also the safety requirement. So based on national legislation, as a landowner in a fire-prone area, it is your responsibility to construct fire breaks to protect your property so that if you have a fire on it, it limits the risk of the fire burning onto a neighbor's property. And likewise, if there's a fire on that side, it limits the risk of that fire jumping into your property. So I'm going to touch a bit on the evolution of Kruger's fire management policy. And this is quite interesting if you think about the theme of this current workshop, also being around about decolonizing fire and fire management. And this touches so nicely on our initial philosophies and thinking of the role of fire in the system and how we needed to suppress it, etc., and how we eventually learned over the decades as to fire's important role, and how we can, as management, still try to ensure that fire fulfills this ecological role in the system. So I'll start in 1926 when the park was first proclaimed, and for the first 2 decades or so, it was a very laissez-faire, relaxed attitude towards fire management. And our first park warden in 1926, Stevenson Hamilton, he came from a military background. And then when he became the warden of the park, he thought fires had a detrimental impact to vegetation and wildlife, and he thought it was very bad. So he then placed a general ban on any deliberate burning in the park. What is quite interesting is that during this time, we still had people living in the park, and humans have been an ignition source in this landscape for a very, very long time. So he came with this mentality that fires are bad and that he needed to stop people from burning in a way in which they have been burning for thousands of years. And then about 10 years later, Stevenson Hamilton then had a complete philosophical change, and he suggested then that the bush actually be burnt every second year, because then he realized that there's this accumulation of moribund or dead grass and fuel material that nothing eats, so it just accumulates over time if a fire doesn't go through the system. And then also when a fire does go through the system, it provides for that green grazing that herbivores enjoy and need, because it's highly nutritious. So it's high in nitrogen, phosphorus, all sorts of elements that's generally quite limited in the system. So yeah, so within that 10-year period, he then realized that fires are necessary in the system. And then just out of interest, this is a hand-drawn map in the 1940s showing where fires occurred during that year. So it just shows how even back then they realized how important fires are. And then if you think about humans and fires, and humans as an ignition source in this landscape, it's quite important to actually look at the map on the right-hand side. So this is just an idea of historical presence in the park. So these are things like ruins, sacred sites, burial sites, any kind of evidence of the presence of people being there. So you can see it's from north to south, east to west, there has been people in this landscape. So we know that anthropogenic fires have been used in Africa for more than 1 million years. And in Southern Africa specifically, humans have been using fires to manipulate the environment for roughly 55,000 years. So these would have been for farming purposes, to cycle nutrients, because they would have understood that feedback between burning and highly nutritious regrowth. And then also to control herbivore movement to facilitate easy hunting of wildlife, because they knew that where there are recently burnt areas, herbivores move and tend to follow these recently burnt areas and congregate on them. Then also early Portuguese explorers referred to the interior of South Africa, so as they were coming around the tip of Africa, as Terra dos Fomos, meaning land of fire and smoke. So fires have been a very old process in this landscape, and humans have been an ignition source of fires in this landscape as well. But what was still interesting is that we then still went into a 10-year period called our so-called fire protection or fire suppression era back in the late 40s, early 50s. And this coincided with the Soil Conservation Act. So there was this perceived negative effects of fires on soils that would lead to soil erosion and land degradation. So there was this national ban placed on any prescribed or deliberate burning across the country. And of course, Kruger had to follow suit, but also coincided with that national policy, as that we had our second park warden, Colonel Sandenberg, and he also came from a military background. And this is just a quote that was minuted, where he says, "I am convinced that the past policy of burning has caused a change for the worse in our vegetation, and that this change has had a profound influence on the distribution and breeding rate of wildlife in the park. Deliberate burning in an area which must be kept natural must cause an upset to any natural balance." So he too had that very negative perception of fires in this landscape. There was also emergent issues during this time, one of which was that we just didn't have the manpower to even try to keep fires or limit fires in this fire-prone landscape. We only had 8 rangers in the whole of Kruger National Park, responsible for roughly 250,000 hectares each. So of course, it was nearly impossible to implement this kind of fire suppression policy in the park. And on an annual basis, on average, 20% of Kruger was still burning every year. And if you look at, these are the amount of area in Kruger that is burnt in hectares over all the various years. And during this era where we had this fire suppression, you can still see we had fires on an annual basis. And in 1 year, almost nearly half of Kruger burnt in 1953. That's about just under 1 million hectares burning in the so-called "we don't want any fires in the park" during that era. So then in 1957, for the next just over 20 years or so, we had a fixed prescribed burning program. So this started after we realized the importance of fire in this landscape for maintaining ecosystems. And then we started grading these fire breaks and breaking the park up into about 400, what they called at the time, burn blocks, average size of about 4,000 hectares. And then what happened is each block would burn once every 3 years after spring rains. So after the rainy season would start around maybe October, November, December maybe, then that block would be burnt. So it was a very certain time of the year that it had to be burnt, and once every 3 years. Then, of course, there were some emerging issues that came with that as well. One, we had a change in grass composition, so we had an increase in unpalatable fire-driven grass species in certain parts of the park. The other problem was the technique in which these blocks were burnt, which is called ring burning. It's not ideal. The fire fronts move towards each other. That's not naturally how a fire burns through the landscape. Changes the intensity. The interior of that block ends up burning really hotter than normal, than even normal single fire front had to burn across it. And then also just this general lack of variation associated with having such a fixed 3-year schedule in such a wide part of the park with so different geology, so many different vegetation types, etc. And then we went into a 10-year period with flexible prescribed burning, where we still kept the 3-year rotation, but now we change the season in which we burn. So what happens if we burn early in the dry season, mid dry season, late dry season, the start of the wet season, etc.? Then we went into another 10-year period where we again changed our management policy to only allowing for lightning fires. So all other ignition sources, those fires needed to be suppressed and actively extinguished. But if it was a lightning fire, that would be allowed to burn to its fullest extent. And when we looked at how much of Kruger was burning because of lightning fires versus all other fires, we then found that in most years, it was all other fire ignition sources that actually burned the majority of Kruger. So it was still quite impossible to actually only allow for lightning ignited fires in this landscape. So these gray bars are actually parts, how many hectares of Kruger burned by lightning fires, but the black bars were all these other ignition sources that they didn't want to have during this so-called area. So then they realized that you needed to actually account for humans as an ignition source in this landscape, because one, it's almost impossible to prevent and stop, and two, humans have always been part of this landscape and we've always been an ignition source. So in 2001, for just over a decade, we then developed this integrated fire management policy where we accounted for combined ignition sources and seasonal variation. So we accounted for fires started by lightning, by managers, by migrants, because there's people still walking through the park during this time, and they also would have ignited fires along the way. So we then determined the amount to burn based on the rainfall that fell in preceding years, and then also how much biomass was available in the bush to actually be burnt. Then the rangers would determine where in the park they would burn and under which weather conditions. So we didn't have that very rigid approach to, you must only burn once every 3 years and after first spring rains. We allowed for that variation in fire patterns and intensities across the park. Then in 2013, we then still had this integrated fire management approach. We then, amount of burn was then calculated based on preceding rainfall. So there was this model or relationship that was developed between mean preceding 2 years rainfall and how much of Kruger is available to burn. We developed fire management zones that indicated the type of fire we wanted in various parts of the park. So which I will talk a bit about later, but there's some parts we want to burn more and hot fires, some places we want to burn less and cooler fires, some places where we don't have any active management fires, etc. So this all depends on the ecological objective that we want to achieve in that part of the park using fire. Then the rangers would determine the way in those fire management zones that would burn. Then in 2019, we updated it. We still have that same approach. We just updating our satellite imagery and the satellites that we use for fire mapping. So we use a combination of MODIS and Sentinel because they both have their pros and cons. We also include burns for anti-poaching reasons as part of our fire management toolbox, because you know that herbivores move in certain patterns and that they often follow these recent burnt areas. So there's this relationship between how animals use the landscape and fires. And then also to be mindful and consider these fire-elephant interactions that we have in this part of the park, because large trees are generally very resilient to fires. They have really thick bark, they can withstand fires, but once they are debarked or damaged by elephants, then they are then vulnerable to that heat of the fire penetrating to the inside of the tree. So fire management zones took into account rainfall, geologies, and fire frequency. So using those more than 60 years worth of fire scar maps, we were able to map where in the park we historically got very frequent fires. Then we came up with a fire management zones in the southwestern part of the park. Here we have ecological concern about improving grazing quality, reducing bush encroachment or bush thickening. So here we want to increase fire frequency and intensity. The eastern part of the park on the basalt here was our ecological concern about increase in unpalatable grass species, loss of tall trees, etc. So here we want to decrease fire frequency and decrease fire intensity. Then there's some parts of the park like the yellow bits over here. These are along our large riparian zones and historically never got very frequent fires. And so we don't put in any active management fires. We just put in fires to protect infrastructure and camps. And if there's a lightning fire, after years of really good rainfall and there's a lot of accumulation of biomass, we will allow that lightning fire to burn to its fullest extent, as long as there's no threat to property or lives. So I just want to quickly finish off on how our fire management loop basically works throughout the year. We start in around April, which is just as we head out of our wet season into our dry season. This is where we calculate our fire targets. So this is based on preceding rainfalls, how much rainfall fell in the park, and how much we predict is available to burn. And these fire targets basically dictate in what part of the park, how many hectares we think is available to burn. And this is based on the fact that rainfall has a direct effect on area burnt in Kruger National Park, based on this. The fact that mean rainfall for the preceding 2 years has a big role to play on how much available fuel there is in Kruger to be burnt. Then the rangers will apply prescribed burns between April and March the following year. Yeah, and then just out of interest, this is just another GIF file showing all our fire scars throughout the park for the last 20 or so years. And as you can see, it's highly dependent on rainfall. That year that was so blank, that was 2016. So we had a drought in 2015, 2016. So there was nothing available to burn. So we had no fires in 2016. It's coming up, so you can check it again. 2015, there we go, blank. And then each time there's a fire that burns in Kruger National Park, it gets reported. So the ranger fills in the report for where there was a fire in his or her section of the park. And then we map the fires using satellite imagery as well. And this happens on a monthly basis throughout the year. This is basically what the fire incident report looks like. So it's blurry, but it basically has the date and time that the fire started and ended, which section of the park it is, GPS coordinates if they have it. Otherwise, they do give us block names. And then fire cause, is it a management fire, a lightning fire, an accidental fire, etc. And then, yeah, and then we map the fires using satellite imagery. And then obviously, you know, as I showed earlier, we've really progressed and advanced since our early hand-drawn maps in the 1940s, then to MODIS in the early 2000s, and currently using Sentinel to map our fires in the park. And then we look at the previous year of burning, and then we actually assess how have we done it according to our targets that we wanted to burn, according to the kind of fires we wanted, the intensity, the extent of the fires in various parts of the park, according to our fire management zones. And that's how we assess if we're sticking towards our target and what kind of fire regimes we want in various parts of the park. And then we go back into the next year to calculating the targets for the following upcoming year ahead. Thank you so much.